Our focus verse is another long one. It's the third chapter of the book of Ruth. And we are in the midst of a study of the book of Ruth. We've had the first two chapters the last 2 weeks. And we have been introduced to Naomi and Naomi's family. She had 2 sons, but there was a famine in Bethlehem where they lived, so they moved to the land of Moab, where the grass was green and they could plant their crops and take care of their livestock. And while they were there, their 2 sons married Moabite women, but Naomi's husband and then the 2 sons died, so the 3 ladies were widows and living together. And Naomi heard that things were once again good in Bethlehem. So they started to make their way to Bethlehem. And then Naomi tried to talk her daughters-in-law into going back to their families where they would be protected and maybe be able to find a new Moabite husband and have a good life like they ought to have. And one of the daughters-in-law did go back to her family, but Ruth clung to Naomi and said, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your God will be my God, and your people, my people." So Ruth went to Bethlehem with Naomi. And chapter 2 was all about Ruth essentially taking care of Naomi and herself by gleaning in the fields. It was harvest time, and the rules were that the farmers had to leave parts of the crop open as they were unharvested as they went through the fields, so that the poor and the aliens and the widows could come and gather barley or wheat, whatever they were had in their fields and were harvesting at that time. So that brings us to today. If you'll remember from last week, Ruth got to Boaz's field, and Boaz was very kind to her. We found out that Boaz was a kin of Naomi, a kin of Elimelech, Naomi's husband, and was what they call a redeemer. The Hebrew word is goel. And what we've been looking for in these stories has been hesed, another Hebrew word that we have been translating God's love in action. There's many other ways to translate that. But that's where we are in the story. And now we begin chapter 3. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you. Now, here is your kinsman Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." She said to her, "All that you tell me, I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had instructed her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk, and he was in a contented mood, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came stealthily and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and there, lying at his feet, was a woman. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." He said to her, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. For all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman. But now, though it is true that I am a near kinsman, there is another kinsman more closely related than I. Remain this night, and in the morning, if he will act as next of kin for you, good, let him do it. If he is not willing to act as next of kin for you, then as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you. Lie down until morning. So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before one person could recognize another. For he said, it must not be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. Then he said, bring the cloak you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her back. Then he went into the city. She came to her mother-in-law, who said, how did things go with you, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, for he said, do not go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. She replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So we have been searching in these stories and in our lives for God's hesed. How we make God's love come alive in our daily lives. And we've been searching, I hope and pray, for God's hesed in our daily lives. And I want to tell you just one quick story before we get too deep into this about God's hesed that Susie and I saw happen at last Sunday's Jethawks game. It was an early evening, 5 o'clock game. So the sun is shining on our regular seats. So rather than walk down the regular seats, we walk up to the seats that are in the shade. And we have some friends that sit a couple of rows in front of us at the Jethawks game. And they were also sitting up in the shade, a couple of rows in front of us. And it so happened that a man, not very old, but old enough. He was wearing camouflage shorts and I think it was a U.S. Marines t-shirt and a camouflage hat. And he was carrying a beer and food and kind of fumbling with things as he was walking up the steps, and he had to stop at the top of the steps and was just absolutely out of breath just from walking up those steps. And our friend Lester got up and walked over to him and said, can I help you with your stuff? And he took his beer and he took his handful of food and let him take enough time to get his breath and head towards his seat. And Lester carried that the food and the beer for him. And Susie looked at me and she said, hesed. And just things like that to look for in our daily lives that we hear from the book of Ruth and we hear all throughout the Bible. But to learn to look for those in our daily lives and say, that's God's love in action. So today we have this story of Ruth going to the threshing floor and uncovering Boaz's feet. And the world has always loved a good love story, hasn't it? From Romeo and Juliet to what are some of the other great love stories that the world knows and loves? I need my clicker. Shout them out. What are some other love stories? Cleopatra? Okay. What else? Adam and Eve. Yeah, not just Bible stories, but what other love stories are there? Beauty and the Beast, there we go. We get one much more contemporary. There are book after book after book in Barnes & Noble and online that you can read about love stories. I happen to have a niece that writes by the name of J.L. Berg, and she writes romance novels. So, and she does really well at this writing of romance novels. So, ladies, if you're into romance novels, look up J.L. Berg. She's got a bunch of books that she's written. But I put that up there not really as an advertisement for her. She's not paying me very much to put that up there. I put that up there to say that romance and love stories are far from dead. And that Boaz and Ruth's story belongs with some of the great love stories that we've seen over the years. Today, Ruth goes to the threshing floor, where all of the harvest has been brought in. The men have worked hard for weeks and weeks, and now it's time to do the threshing, where they separate the husk from the seed that will be ground into flour. And so they've been working and working and working, and the men are finally ready to celebrate. When the harvest comes in, there are so many things that make harvest not work in that time and in that place, and even today. But in that time and place, probably 2 out of 5 years, they never got a harvest. Because of famine, or because of bugs, or some other reason, they couldn't bring in a harvest. But now they brought in a good harvest, and it was time to celebrate. And so we see that they kind of calm it down here in the Bible, and they say when Boaz had eaten and drunk and he was in a contented mood, well, let's face it, he was blitzed, along with the rest of the men. And he laid down to sleep by the stack of barley, freshly milled barley, as a protector of that. So, of course, it's a world where people are hungry, and if you leave a big pile of threshed barley, there's a good chance somebody's going to come by and take an awful lot of it. So he's there as security for his barley. And Ruth comes to him, and she uncovers his feet. We have seen God's hesed, God's love working through these three main characters, Naomi and Ruth and Boaz, and now Naomi is the matchmaker. She tells Ruth to go and lay on the threshing floor and uncover Boaz's feet. And though God has been present throughout all of the story, it seems that there's greater action needed now. Something needs to prod things along so that God's will for God's people can be met. And Naomi is the instigator, and she pushes Ruth a little bit. And she pushes her right in the direction of Boaz, and it's that big night of the harvest, and we talk about her uncovering feet. And in the Bible, in many places, the uncovering of feet has nothing to do with uncovering feet. And it's a lot more intimate than just uncovering somebody's feet. A little bit more than just playing this piggy went to market. How much sex somebody wants to read into a story like this depends on where you're at the time and how much you want to read into it. But that's the euphemism that is going on, that uncovering of feet is a euphemism for sex. But if we get hung up on the sexual part of this story, we miss the true points of this story. Sometimes we need to do as Naomi and Ruth did and kind of skip the letter of the law and move to the purpose of the law to make God's will come about. And now that Ruth is there with Boaz, Boaz goes along. And Boaz takes a huge step. When Ruth says, throw your cloak over me, that means marry me. Take me into your family and have me as your wife. And Boaz goes along with this, but he says, there might be one kink in this. And we'll read more about this kink next week, but it's the fact that there is another relative that has a greater claim to Naomi and Ruth than Boaz does. But in this story, we see God's hesed. We see God working through Boaz and Ruth and Naomi. And because of the daring, creative love, God's will moves forward in this story. And next week, we'll see it grow even more as they meet this new Goel, this new Redeemer. And they find out, well, I'm not going to ruin the story. But in this story, the love goes beyond the realms of acceptance. So too, we are called to love and allow God's love and grace to shine brightly in our lives. We are called to love God with all our heart and all our soul and all our mind, and we're called to love our neighbor as ourself. And we are called to show God's hesed, God's love in action to all that we meet this week and every week. Amen. Let's stand as we sing this song.